In this chapter, we're going to be learning the perfect tense. Now, the good news is that this is the last tense you have to learn. And when you're done with the perfect tense, you're done with the entire indicative verbal system. Now, there's going to be a few non-indicative things we have to learn for the rest of the book. But this is a great milestone for you, the last of the tenses and the end of the indicative verbal system. So, congratulations. We don't really have anything like the perfect tense in English, but we have some bits and pieces. And let me name three of them. When you put a verb in the past time, you're describing a past action. Okay. The perfect generally describes actions occurring in the past. So there's some overlap there, little overlap. There's more overlap when you start talking about the helping verbs have and the third person singular has. When you say, if you're a native English speaker, have or has, what you are feeling is pretty close, feeling in terms of significance, is pretty close to what's going on in the perfect. But it's really hard to define. In fact, when I was writing BBG initially, I went to all my English language buddies and said, what does have really mean? What does has really mean? And I couldn't get a consensus in terms of a precise definition of what have and has means in English. The closest we could come up to is this. Have and has indicates an action that was done in the recent past, and the action, the statement made by the action, is still accurate. Okay, so have and has. If I have read, I have studied, he has gone to the store. Okay, the use of have and has describe an action that was done in the recent past, and the statement made by that verb is still accurate in the present. Okay, that's getting into the arena of the Greek perfect tense. But the third overlap is one of the uses we have of the present tense. We can use the present tense in English to describe the current consequences of a past action. In other words, I can say, it is written. And I'm not just describing a past action. I'm saying it was written, and the assumption is, and an obvious assumption is that it was written in the past. But there are present day consequences of this past event. Okay, so it is written, or it stands written. All right. If you take those three and kind of put them together, we're somewhere in the ballpark of what the perfect tense in Greek is all about. Here's my definition of the perfect tense. A verb in the perfect tense describes an action that was brought to completion and whose effects are still felt in the present. And those are the two halves of the perfect, and they're really important. The perfect tense describes an action that was brought to completion. There'll be something about the nature of the verb and something about the nature of the action that the perfect tense is saying, this was completed, it was finalized, it was fully done. But at the same time, it's going to be saying that there's consequences to this completed action. And the consequences of that action are still being felt by me today, me being the speaker or the writer. Hear the difference in these forms in English. If I said Jesus died, that's an aorist in Greek. Okay, it's a simple description of a past event. If I say Jesus has died, in the Greek that'd be in the perfect, I'm describing an action that was completed, and you kind of like you expect me to fill it out, don't you? If I just say, well, Jesus has died, and you go, yeah, and okay, what are you trying to say? Well, you're not just trying to say that he died. You're trying to say he has died for my sins. He has died so that we can have access to the Father. I mean, there's some kind of present day consequence that comes about because of the completed action, okay? So you can have Jesus died, or you can have Jesus has died. There's another way to do this, though, with the perfects, and I have to switch into the English present to do it. And that is the it is written, or it stands written. See, I can say, Jesus has died for my sins, and the has died is pushing emphasis on the completed action. But if I say it is written, then I'm saying the emphasis of the perfect tense verb in Greek is on the present consequences. So again, there's these two halves to the perfect. They are the completed action, and because it's completed, the perfect normally describes an action occurring in the past. And that's when we tend to use the have or the has. But if we think that the emphasis of the Greek perfect is on the ongoing consequences, we can shift, well, in order to really bring that out, we need to shift into the present English. Jesus has died. It is written. Okay? So those are the two halves of the perfect tense, and both are really, really important. So how are we going to translate a Greek perfect? Well, on the one hand, we can use the helping verbs have and has. Do not use had, H-A-D. Had has a different significance, and we're going to save it for something else in Greek. But you can use have and has, and have and has is almost always an accurate translation of the perfect. And your teacher, at least for right now, may want you to stick with have or has. Check with your teacher. I'm going to give you a little bit of flexibility, but for right now, they may want you using have and has. But the have and has tends to put the emphasis on the completed the completed part of the action, okay? I would say, though, that there's another legitimate way to translate the perfect, and that is, if you think contextually, the emphasis is on the ongoing consequences in the present, then I think you can translate a Greek perfect with the English present. It is written. Now, what I used to do in class was when we were at chapter 25, I'd say, look, for right now, stick with the have and has. Okay, don't use the present. Definitely don't use the had. And I would wait until I thought the students kind of was comfortable with the have and has. And then I'd say, okay, go ahead and use a English present to translate the Greek perfect if you think that contextually it's necessary. So start with have, has, just to kind of get that into your head. And then if your teacher lets you, later on switch into the English present if you think that's what's going on. A good example of that is the phrase, the kingdom of God has drawn near. Or would you translate that phrase, the kingdom of God is near? Well, see, that's a perfect, and that's, well, where's the action, on the completion or on the consequences? And again, just ask your teacher what he or she wants you to do on that, okay? Okay, so much for the basic meaning of the perfect. Let's look at the formation. So let's start with the perfect active. How do you form a perfect active indicative? Well, you start with something called reduplication. I'll explain that in a second. And then you have the perfect active tense stem. So we have a different tense stem in the perfect. And then to that, we're going to add a tense formative. And the tense formative for the perfect active is kappa alpha. It's going to look a lot like sigma alpha in the aorist, but it's kappa alpha for the perfect. And then because it's an unaugmented tense, we're going to use primary active personal endings. And you get a form like leleukamin. Now, when you look at leleukamin, you see that initial lambda? Okay, that's the reduplicated consonant. In a nutshell, what reduplication is for a verb like luel is that it reduplicates, or it doubles that initial consonant and then separates it with an epsilon. So lu goes to lelu, and add the ka and then the personal ending, and you get leleukamin. Okay, so that's how you form the perfect active indicative. Here's the paradigm. Now, set aside the third plural for a second. As you look down that paradigm, you can see the endings as you would, for the most part, expect them to be. But it's interesting to compare that to the aorist, isn't it? Leluka, elusa, lelukas, elusas. In one sense, the perfect looks a lot like the first aorist, doesn't it? You don't have a personal ending in the first person singular, so you have leluka in the aorist, elusa. You have the shift from ka to ke in the third person singular. But technically, because the perfect is unaugmented, it's a primary tense. But it ends up looking a lot like the secondary first aorist, doesn't it? So 3 things here for your exception list. In the first person singular, there's no personal ending used, so you have leluka. In the third person singular, you have the shift from ka to ke. But again, because you have the sa to se in the first aorist, that shouldn't be a problem for you. But the third thing you're going to need to add to your exception list is this third plural alternate ending, asi. Now, technically, the third person plural ending is nsi, isn't it? So this is really close to what the ending actually is. The news just dropped off. But most people just teach this as an alternate third plural ending. So there's 3 more entries for your exception list. Now, there is a second perfect active, but it's so rare, and it's just better just to memorize the forms. Ginomai has a second perfect in the active. Technically speaking, for a second perfect active, the tense formative is alpha, not kappa alpha. But it's just easier, I think, to learn the forms, and you'll be able to make sense of them when you see them. All right. Well, let's leave the perfect active and let's go to the perfect middle passive. How do you form perfect middle passive? Well, you have reduplication. You have a perfect middle passive tense stem, so it's another tense stem entirely. And then you have primary middle passive personal endings. There's no tense formed, or there's no connecting vowel. The secondary middle passive endings are stuck directly onto the perfect middle passive tense stem. And by the way, that's why there's no such thing as a second perfect middle passive. But there's no tense formative in the regular perfect middle passive, so there can't be a second. So just the perfect middle passive indicative. And you end up with a form like lelumai. Now, before you get frustrated that, oh, where'd the vowel go? This is actually a real blessing in disguise, because this is the only place in the Greek verbal system where you have the personal endings put up right against the stem. Otherwise, there's always a connecting vowel or a tense formative in there. But in the perfect middle passive, that personal ending is stuck right up against the tense stem. So you're reading along and you see a form, and if you don't recognize it, it's confusing. If you notice that there's nothing between the tense stem and the personal ending, it has to be a perfect middle passive. So this is one of those nice little things in the Greek language that you like the fact that there's no vowel there. Okay, all right, let's look at the paradigm. The paradigm is blissfully regular: lelumai, lelusai, lelutai, lelumitha, lelustha, leluntai. Look at that second person singular, lelusai. It's the regular ending side. It's the only place the sigma doesn't drop out. And you get to see the true personal ending. That's pretty wonderful. Okay, so much for paradigms. Let's go back to the beginning part of a verb and let's look at the rules for reduplication. There's only a couple of basic rules for reduplication, and they're not hard to learn. And it really all has to do with what's the first letter in the root. That's what determines what rule is applied. The first rule of reduplication is called consonantal reduplication. And in consonantal reduplication, this is applied to roots that begin with a single consonant, like luo. And in consonantal reduplication, as you've seen, that initial consonant is reduplicated and separated from the stem with an epsilon. So lu goes to lelu, and then you get lelucamin. Okay, so that's consonantal reduplication. The only time you get a little oddity in this is if that initial consonant is an aspirated stop. Do you remember the far right column in the square stops? Those were the aspirated stops, the phi, the he, and the theta. And Greeks don't like two consecutive syllables both beginning with an aspirated sound. They didn't like to say well, nobody would, I guess. And so what they did, it's technically called deaspiration. They deaspirate the reduplicated consonant. Now, this is actually the opposite of what we saw in the aorist passive. When you have a stem ending in a stop and then you have the theta, in order to say the two sounds together, they aspirated the stop. Remember that? Well, when it comes to reduplication, though, because they're two different syllables separated by that vowel, they're going to deaspirate the reduplicated stop. Here, take a look at the chart. You have phanerao. They didn't want to say fiphaneroka. So they take the phi and they take it to its corresponding stop to the p, and you get piphaneroka, all right? He's deaspirate to kappas. So charidzo goes to kekar, goes to kekarismai. And therapuo would go to thethe, which then gets deaspirated to tetherapumai. So that's just one of the little oddities when it comes to reduplicating a root that begins with an aspirated stop. Okay, but that's it for consonantal reduplication. The second rule of reduplication has to do with verbs that begin with a vowel, and is called vocalic reduplication. And basically what happens if the root begins with a vowel and it needs to be reduplicated, the rule of vocalic reduplication merely lengthens that vowel. Alphas and epsilons lengthen to eta, omicrons lengthen to omega. So agapao goes to agapeka. In a vocalic reduplication looks just like an augment, okay? But it's really important that you know that it's not an augment. Don't call vocalic reduplication an augment, please, okay? They look alike, but they're telling us two totally different things. The augment is putting something in past time, and the vocalic reduplication is indicating completed action with ongoing consequences. And as you'll see when we get out of the indicative system, an augment and a vocalic reduplication behave differently outside the indicative, okay? So they look like augments, but they don't really function as augments, okay? A couple of sub-rules on vocalic reduplication: that if a verb begins with a diphthong, we have the same kind of thing we had with the aorist. The first vowel usually will lengthen. If the second vowel of the diphthong is an iota, it's going to subscript. So aiteo goes to ateka. But diphthongs are naughty in the perfect as they are in the aorist. They don't like to follow the rules. And especially initial epsilon, upsilon, when it undergoes vocalic reduplication, it doesn't look any different, okay? It just stays the same. But it's still been reduplicated. You're still in the perfect tense. You just have to look somewhere else for an indication that you're in the perfect tense. The other sub-rule has to do with stems that begin with consonant clusters, two or more consonants in a row. And instead of undergoing consonantal reduplication, these roots will undergo vocalic. For example, you learned the root gno that shows itself in the present as gnosko, but in the perfect it's egnoka. Okay, so there's an epsilon like it's vocalic, instead of some kind of consonantal reduplication. Okay, but that's it for the rules for reduplication. So that's not that hard, isn't it? Okay, we're to the point of the odds and ends for the chapter. Let's cover 3 or 4 of the odds and ends. Number 1 has to do with stems that end in a stop. When in the perfect middle passive, if you have a root ending in a stop and it's going to come up right against the personal ending, that final stop often changes. And I've never found it really important that you memorize the rules as to how they're going to change. I simply have told the students expect it to change and they can parse it fine. But your teacher may want you to memorize the patterns, and I gave them to you in the advanced information. Certainly, even if you don't have to memorize them, you should be aware of them, so look at them, okay? So the first odds and end is for if a root ends in a stop, that stop will most likely change when it comes up against the personal ending in the perfect middle passive. Okay. In terms of compound verbs, as you would expect from compound verbs in the aorist, when you apply the reduplication, it's the verbal part of the compound that receives the reduplication, not the perfect. When it comes to contract verbs, they're absolutely regular. The final contract vowel lengthens before the tense formative. And actually in the perfect middle passive, that final contract vowel lengthens as if there were a tense formative there. There's not, but it still does the lengthening. And in terms of principal parts, the perfect active is the 4th, and the perfect middle passive is the 5th. Okay? So, for example, if you're going to go to the lexicon and look up luo, this is the kind of thing you're going to see. You'll see luo, and because luo occurs in the imperfect, in BBG I'll list eluon in parentheses, but then the second tense form is luso, the future active, elusa, the aorist active, and then there's a dash there because luo doesn't occur as a perfect active, but that's the slot where the perfect active would be. And then there's the 5th tense form, lelumai, that's the perfect middle passive. And finally, the 6th form, eluthane, the aorist passive. Okay, that's it for the perfect. And now, drum roll please, it's time for the middle. I hope I didn't build up too much anticipation or expectation by putting the middle off. It's not that big of a deal, but it's a nuanced kind of thing, and it's a little hard to process when you're just learning your tenses, so I just took it off in this chapter. But what is the middle voice, technically? When a verb is in the middle voice, it means that the action of the verb is done in some way that affects the subject. If you have a verb in the middle, you have a subject doing the verb, and you still have a direct object that's directly receiving the action of the verb. But when the verb is in the middle, the subject is doing the action in some way where the action, in a sense, comes back to the subject. In fact, if you look at most Greek grammars, you go to the paradigms for the middle, they'll say something like, I loose for myself. You loose for yourself. He looses for himself. And while it's kind of an artificial way to say it, what we're trying to say is that when a verb is in the middle, the subject is still doing the action to the direct object, but it's doing it in some way such that the action is including the subject as well. All right? The subject's not the direct object, but it's somehow involved in the action. I made up the phrase self-interest because I couldn't find a phrase that I really liked that explained the sense of what was going on in the middle. So when a verb is in the middle, the subject is doing the action of the verb to the direct object, but there's an idea of self-interest that in some way the action is going to come back to the subject. What I'm really concerned about in the middle is all the misunderstanding that's out there. Because, and I'll talk about this in a second, because of how the middle functioned in classical Greek, it's very common for people in reading Koine Greek to assume that all of the significance of the middle and classical is still there in the Koine, and every time they see a middle, that they're reading this notion into it. And the classical meaning of the middle simply isn't present anymore in Koine. The middle's going away in Koine. It's just disappearing. And actually, the main use of the middle in classical Greek maybe occurs once, but even that point is debated in the New Testament. So I'm trying to be sensitive to how I know the middle is misinterpreted out there. So if a verb is in the middle, it is the subject still doing the action of the verb. The direct object is still directly receiving the action of the verb. And yet there's something about the nature of the action that includes the subject in this self-interest kind of way. Now, having said that, let me emphasize that most middles are active in meaning. They're active either because they're deponent or because the middle nuance is so slight, it's so gentle, that there's simply no way to translate it in English, and we just use an active form of the verb. That's why God gave the church teachers and preachers, so they can talk about some of these nuances. But when it comes to translation, it's really hard in most cases to bring the subtle idea of a middle into English. And by the way, in an advanced grammar like Dan Wallace's or an intermediate, the technical term for this is the indirect middle. That's the phraseology that's used. Okay, so the middle voice indicates an action that is done by the subject of the direct object, but done in some way that it affects the subject. All right? It's the idea that the subject is acting in some way in his or her or its self-interest. We call that the indirect middle. All right. Understand that this slight nuance is the least common uses of the middle, all right? What's going to happen is that you're going to be reading along in context, and you're going to translate as a perhaps you can look at it as a passive or perhaps as an active, and there's going to be something in the context that doesn't quite fit. It doesn't quite make sense. That's when you ask yourself, I wonder if this could be a true middle, an indirect middle. And what you do is you go to the dictionary and you'd say, does this word have any kind of special nuance in the middle? And you will find, for example, that there are some words that characteristically do have this idea of self-interest when they function in a middle form. Aiteo, for example, means I ask in the active. But when you find aiteo in the middle, it might, if context is suggesting it, it might mean I ask for myself. In other words, if you're going to use aiteo of praying to God, you're not talking about intercessory prayer, you're talking about praying for yourself, most likely. Again, if context will allow you to do that. Baptizo has a slight meaning like this in the middle. In the active, baptizo means I dip, I baptize. And in the middle, it means I dip myself. It actually is getting pretty close to the reflexive idea, which I'm going to talk about in a second. But again, we know that the verb baptizo does have a bit of this self-interest in the middle. It's part of the meaning of the verb. Heurisco means I find in the active. It means I obtain for myself in the middle. So everything is context and the meaning of the verbs when it comes to this middle. Now, personally, I'm glad that the middle is going out of use in the Koine. It's a difficult thing because it's such an issue of nuance. And as I said before, almost all middle forms are actually active. either because they're deponent or because the nuance of the middle of self-interest is so slight it simply can't come into English any other way. Now, having said all that, let me talk a bit about classical Greek so you know what I'm balancing this against. We have what is called the reflexive or the direct middle in Koine Greek. This is the use of the middle in classical Greek. When you saw a verb in the middle, you would assume that it is reflexive. But the fact of the matter is that this use of the middle is really rare in the New Testament. In fact, the grammars only identify one place where it's used, and some grammars even argue that it's not reflexive. So this use of the middle in classical Greek may not even be in the New Testament anymore. But in the reflexive middle, if you saw a middle in classical Greek, you would supply the reflexive pronoun. And so if you wanted to say Judas hung himself, that's the reflexive pronoun, you would say Judas hung, and you put the hung in the middle, and the reader would know that he hung himself. In a reflexive middle, the subject both does and receives the action of the verb. By the time you get to koine, and this is also true in English, if you want to really be reflexive, you have to have a reflexive pronoun. So Paul tells the Christians, consider yourselves dead to sin. That yourselves is actually a reflexive pronoun. It's not the middle voice. So the middle in classical Greek was reflexive. It's going out of use. You could even argue it's gone out of use in the New Testament era. And if you want to be reflexive, you have to have a reflexive pronoun, okay? All right. Now, that's a lot to say about the meaning of the middle, but I thought it was important to make those clarifications. In terms of parsing, this is a bit arbitrary, and check with your teacher. He or she may have a different way they want you to do this. But this is how I taught my students to parse middles. If you're in the future or the aorist, the middle and the passive forms are different. So you know whether it's a middle or a passive, or a middle deponent or a passive deponent. So those are relatively easy to parse. But if you're in the other tenses, if you're in a present or a perfect where the middle and the passive are identical, my recommendation is just assume that it's passive or deponent. All right. In the vast majority of cases, it's going to be that way. And what will happen is you'll be reading along and you'll say, oh, it could be a middle or passive. It's probably a passive. And it's not going to make sense. And you go, oh, wait a minute. Oh, maybe this is a middle. It's that kind of thing. So check with your teacher, though, how they want you to do this. All right, that's all there was to the middle. That wasn't bad, was it? But again, it's an issue of nuance and context and the meaning of verbs, so it was a little too much to introduce in chapter 16, I thought. All right, so in summary, what have we learned in this chapter? Well, we've learned that the perfect tense indicates a completed action with effects felt in the speaker's present. And in translating a perfect, you can always use have and has, or if your teacher will allow it, if you think context requires the emphasis to be placed on its present effects, you can switch into the English present tense. We learned that the form, the perfect, you have reduplication and the perfect active or the perfect middle passive tense stem. And then in the active, you have a tense formative ka and then primary personal endings. And we added into our exception list the third person singular, leluke, and the third person plural, lelukasi. We learned the rules of reduplication, that if a root begins with a single consonant, that consonant is reduplicated and separated with an epsilon. And if that initial consonant is an aspirated stop, a phi, he, or theta, then the reduplicated consonant will shift to a p, kappa, or tau. And we learned the second rule of reduplication, vocalic reduplication. For roots that begin with a vowel, that vowel lengthens. Vocalic reduplication is going to look just like an augment, but it's not an augment, and you're not going to call it an augment, right? If a verb has an initial diphthong, the initial letter of the diphthong will lengthen. If the second letter of the diphthong is an iota, it will subscript. And yet epsilon upsilon is an especially naughty diphthong, and it won't show the vocalic reduplication. And if a root begins with a double consonant, it tends to undergo vocalic reduplication by inserting an epsilon before it. We saw a bunch of odds and ends. that if the root ends in a stop in the perfect middle passive, that final stop will change. We saw that compound verbs and contract verbs behave as you would expect them to. I noted that the second perfect is very unusual in Koine Greek and is probably easier just to memorize them, but if you want to memorize it, the tense formative is an alpha. And we saw that the perfect active is the fourth tense stem and the perfect middle passive is the fifth tense stem as listed in the lexicon. And then there's the middle voice. The action of a verb in the middle voice in some way affects the subject. And we're going to use the phrase self-interest to indicate that. Self-interest is not reflexive. In Koine Greek, unlike classical Greek, if you wanted to be reflexive, consider yourselves dead, then you're going to have a reflexive pronoun. Fact of the matter is that almost all middles come into English translation as actives, either because they're deponents or because the nuance is so slight from the middle voice that you simply can't translate it. For the most part, you'll know that you need to pay attention to the middle voice of a verb when you're in context and the normal translation is not making sense, and you will check the definition of the word in the lexicon and see if it carries a special nuance for the middle voice. And as far as parsing middles is concerned, in the future, in the aorist, you'll know the difference in form between the middle and the passive, so you can say middle or passive. But in the present or the perfect, where the forms are identical, it's probably easiest just assume passive or deponent, and then go into your translation, see if it makes sense, and if it doesn't, go back and check to see if perhaps it could be a middle. And we come to the master verb chart and add 3 more lines into it. Now there are 2 more lines that are added to the master verb chart in the advanced information, but if you don't have to learn the advanced information, then these are the last 3 lines in the master verb chart. How do you form a first perfect active? Well, now we know what the redupe means in this column. The first perfect active is formed with reduplication, the perfect active tense stem, kappa alpha is a tense formative, primary active personal endings, and you get leluka. How do you form a second perfect active? Well, it's just like the first perfect, except the tense formative is an alpha, and you get gegana. And then how do you form a perfect middle passive? It's with the reduplication, the perfect middle passive tense stem, no tense formative or connecting vowel, but primary middle passive personal endings, and you have lelumai. Well, there you go. Last tense, done with the indicative. Congratulations. Let me give you just a couple of general things before we jump into the vocabulary. The previous word section in this chapter is, as you might suspect, very large. But I would really encourage you to spend time going through it, just very slowly going through, making sure that it all makes sense. This is the last previous word section you're going to have, so that's pretty good. The additional information is also a very long section. And again, I don't know whether your teacher is going to require you to know it or not. But even if you're not required to know it, you probably should at least read through it. There's stuff in there that, like the optative. And if you aren't aware of that there is something called the optative, when you see it later in second year Greek, you're going to go, why did Mounce skip the optative? Well, just read through the additional information, even if you don't have to memorize it, okay? There's also a section in the back, and I've referred to it earlier, and its title is something like 10 stems of verbs occurring 50 times or more. Okay, now it really is the right time to go and to start looking at all the different tense forms of all these different verbs and deciding which ones you need to memorize and which ones you'll recognize knowing the rules, okay? There also is a section in the appendix which is the summary of the indicative learning using Lewell. And I just encourage you to work through those pages and just make sure it's all clear, okay? And of course, you really need to know the master verb chart. So in the appendix, the entire master verb chart is back there as well. So spend some time in the previous word section, in the advanced information section, then go in the appendix and just spend some time looking through the forms and making sure that everything's going to be straight for you. Okay? All right. Well, let's get to the vocabulary and then we'll be done with the chapter. Aiteo. I ask, demand. Malon. More, rather. Martyreo. I bear witness, testify. Well, welcome to class. Today we're going to be looking at chapter 26. We're going to be starting our pilgrimage in the participles. Years ago, I used to tell students that this was the hardest part of Greek. Participles, certainly for most people, cause the greatest amount of consternation of all parts of learning Greek. But it was really interesting. The last couple of years that I taught Greek, I got to the end of the participles and I asked the students, okay, was this hard? And they go, no, no big deal at all. So I think we figured out how to teach participles and make it so it's not quite so hard. Now, having said that, though, it is really important that you get caught up on everything. So I have the same message now that I had for you back in chapter 15. What's going to happen in participles is that we're going to take the noun system and the verb system, and in one sense, we're going to merge them together, all right? We're going to stick them together. And so, noun system, that's a piece of cake now. But if you're not caught up with your verbs, it can get a little frustrating to do this. So I would say it is important to really get caught up on your verbs. But other than that, you'll need to work at the participles. You'll have to think about them. But they shouldn't cause you a great amount of problem, okay? What I did was I broke up the discussion of participles into multiple chapters. In chapter 26, this chapter, I'm going to cover almost all of the grammar of the participles. In other words, in terms of the meaning of the participles and the theory behind the participles, it's all in this chapter. Chapters 27 through 30 then only have to do with the form of the participle. And the participles are all built on tense stems that we're used to. They all use case endings that we're used to. So I'm going to be putting things together perhaps in ways you're not used to, but there's nothing really new to learn there in terms of form. Well, maybe a little something, but same tenses, same case endings. So in this is the important chapter is what I'm trying to say. This is the chapter where we're going to really make sure we understand in theory what a participle is, how they get put together, and what they mean. And after that, it's just a matter of dotting I's and crossing T's, okay? All right. I'm going to be showing you some different forms of Greek participles in this chapter. Don't feel any need to memorize these, okay? They're simply there for illustration, and so don't worry about trying to memorize the forms. Just enjoy learning the grammar and the theory behind participles, okay? All right. English first. In English, participles are ing words: eating, sleeping, sitting, flunking, passing. Now, technically in English, you have participles and gerunds, and participles are adjectival and gerunds are noun. But in Greek, you don't have that distinction. So what I do when I talk about participles, even in English, I just say participles are ing words, okay? And so we'll let the purists deal with gerunds later on. Participles are ing words. Their technical definition is that they are verbal adjectives. Now, if you hear anything in this class, that's what I want you to hear. Participles are verbal adjectives. And if you can get through that, over that hurdle, this chapter is simple. For me, when I was learning participles, this is what was hard for me. I could, well, how can you have a verb and have it be an adjective? How can you have a present tense form and a genitive singular case ending? And I had conceptual problems putting that together. Once I figured out that participles are verbal adjectives, everything else became easy when it came to participles, okay? So that's the main thing I want you to see. Let me give you a couple of examples and talk about some of the grammar. And here I'm mostly in English, but I'm thinking ahead to Greek as well. If I gave you a sentence like, while eating, my Greek teacher gave us the final. Okay? While eating, my Greek teacher gave us the final. Eating is the participle, right? It's the ing form. Who is doing the eating? Is it the teacher or is it us? Well, in English grammar, and this is important, that's answered by proximity. The noun that's closest to the participle is doing the action of the participle. Or to state it the other way, the participle is modifying the closest noun. So when it's while eating, my Greek teacher gave us. Teacher is closer to eating than us. So it's the teacher who's doing the eating, okay? Now, that's important because in Greek, proximity doesn't mean much of anything. Okay, and we're going to use case, number, and gender to link a participle back to the word that is doing the action of the participle, the word that the participle is modifying, okay? But in English, it's proximity. So while eating, my Greek teacher gave us the final. And you can kind of feel in that example, eating, that it's the verbal side of the participle is being stressed, right? Now, the eating does modify something. It's teacher, so that's the adjectival side. But contextually, while eating is telling you something primarily about the giving, right? What was going on when the teacher gave us? Well, he was eating. When he was eating, it was while he was eating that he gave us the test. Okay, so contextually, you can feel the participle is, in terms of meaning, is modifying the verb. And technically, it's modifying the noun, but you get the idea. It's adverbial in its force, okay? Well, we can have another example where you can feel more the adjectival nature of the participle. If I said something like, the woman sitting by the window is my Greek teacher. Okay, the woman sitting by the window is my Greek teacher. Sitting is your participle. And who's doing the sitting? Well, the woman is. And see, the participle sitting is simply giving you an attribute. It's just an adjective, right? It's just giving you an attribute of the woman. The woman. Well, which woman? The woman sitting by the window. Okay, that woman is my Greek teacher. Okay, so there you can kind of feel more of the adjectival side of the participle. So participles are ing words. They are verbal adjectives, okay? The other phrase, the grammatical term that you need to know is the phrase participial phrase. Participial phrase refers to the participle and everything that goes with it. This is really important in translation because when you see a participle, you need to identify the beginning and the end of the participial phrase, okay? And, draw your lines through and keep it separate. So the participial phrase is the participle in anything that modifies it, a direct object, an adverb, a prepositional phrase, whatever it is, okay? So that's basically what's going on in English. Okay, let's switch over into Greek. And the definition for a participle in Greek is the same basic definition. In Greek, a participle is a verbal adjective. Because it is verbal, it's going to be built on a verb, and it's going to have tense, present, aorist, and perfect, and it's going to have voice, active, middle, passive, and deponent, all right? Now, thankfully, participles don't have any personal endings, which is nice. You can get rid of those. But because a participle is a verbal adjective, it's going to have tense, and it's going to have voice, okay? But a participle is also a verbal adjective, and as an adjective, it has to modify something. And how does a participle link itself to a noun? Well, how does an adjective link itself to a noun? Case, number, and gender, right? Yeah, the participle will agree with the noun that it's modifying in case, number, and gender. And that linkage tells you who's actually doing the action of the participle. That's what's nice about it, okay? And again, like I said, when I was learning Greek, it was strange to put tense and case together, but you just got to get over it. Okay, let it just sleep on it. It'll make sense tomorrow for you, I would think. At its most basic level, this is what participles are, okay? They are ing words, and you're gonna look at them, and you're gonna see the verb, and you're gonna see what it modifies. You're gonna put an ing on it, and its most basic level, that's what you have. That's pretty good, isn't it? All right. So, basics of Greek definition of participle is a verbal adjective. Now, I said that participles are built on verbs. Let me talk a little bit about how, in general, participles are formed. And I'm going to give you some illustrations, and I think you're going to be able to figure out what it is without me telling you a whole lot. I have to tell you a little something, but let me show you what I mean. The basic way a participle is formed is that it starts with a tense stem of a verb. So participles are built on a verb. And to that verb is added what's called the participial morpheme. Now, a morpheme is the smallest unit of meaning in a word. So like a personal ending is a morpheme or a case ending is a morpheme, okay? Well, we actually have morphemes. They're 2 or 3 letters long. And it's the actual thing that says, hey, this verb is a participle, all right? So it's the participial morpheme. And then thirdly, onto the end of the participial morpheme is the case endings. So that at its most basic level is how we put participles together. Verb, participial morpheme, case ending. Now let me show you a couple of examples. Let's just kind of figure this out on our own, okay? Let's say you saw the form Lou on tests. What is it? Well, it's obviously from Louisville, right? The fact that I highlighted in yellow gives it away a little, but yeah, this is Louisville, okay? Well, there's Lou, so you know that much. The omicron is a connecting vowel that sometimes you just like in the indicative system, it's hard to pronounce, to go from to pronounce the verb going right into the tense to the participial morpheme. So they stick a connecting vowel in there, but that's no big deal. The new tau is actually one of the two active morphemes, active participial morphemes. There's a couple of active morphemes and then one passive morpheme, all right? So you have Lou, you have a connecting vowel, then you have the active morpheme, participial morpheme, and then you have your case ending. So tell me what this is. Well, what tense do you think it is? Well, there's nothing that's going to put it into the aorist or the perfect, right? So this is a present, and because new tau is the active morpheme, you know that this is a present active participle. Case number and gender, nominative plural masculine, right? It's from Louisville, and what would be its inflected meaning? Well, loosing. There, see, that's not hard, is it? See, again, I'm especially concerned for any of you who have heard about participles, or especially if you had taken a course with a different textbook, you can come into participles with some fear. But it's not that hard, is it? Okay, let's take another word and let's pull it apart and see what it is. Pistiusantes. Okay, what is this? Well, it's obviously from pistule, right? There's the pistiu. But then you have a sigma alpha. What does that normally tell you? Well, it normally tells you you're in the aorist, aren't you? And pistule has a first aorist, so it's a sigma alpha. But what's missing if this is an aorist? There's no augment. Okay, now here's the important rule. Once you're out of the indicative system, so this applies to participles and infinitives, imperatives, and the other stuff we have to learn in BBG still. Once you're outside of the indicative system, time almost ceases to exist. In other words, the verbal constructions don't, except at one technical level, they don't care at all about time. They only care about aspect. Okay, that's really, in terms of meaning, that's a really important thing. The participial system is built on aspect, all right? And we're going to have a continuous participle, we're going to have an undefined participle, and we're going to have a completed participle, all right? What does the augment indicate in the indicative? It indicates time, doesn't it? It indicates past time. So if you're going to form an aorist participle, you got to get rid of the augment. See, it just makes sense, doesn't it? So pistiu is from pistule. The sa tells you this is an aorist participle. No augment because there's no time in the non-indicative verbal systems. The new tau tells you it's an active, and epsilon sigma again is the case ending. So what is pistiusantes? Well, it's an aorist active participle, nominative plural masculine from pistule, meaning believing. See, it's not hard, isn't it? Okay, let's take one more. Pipoiekates. What's that? Well, it's from poieo, isn't it? Yeah. And so you have the lengthening epsilon to an eta before the tense formative. You have reduplication, don't you? Okay, then there's the kappa. So it looks like you're in the perfect. Now, it's a little different because you're used to kappa alpha as a tense formative, right? Well, kappa alpha is a tense formative for the perfect in the indicative. The simple kappa by itself is a tense formative for the perfect in the participles, okay? So this is a perfect participle. Now, the thing you don't know is that omicron tau is the other active participle morpheme, okay? It's the morpheme that's used for the perfect or the completed participle. So what is this? Well, it's a perfect active participle. It is a nominative plural masculine from poieo, and it means, well, making, doing, or having made, having done, something like that. We'll fine-tune that a bit. But doing, making, okay, that's a simple way to translate it. So that's in essence what goes on with the formation of the participles. That's not hard, is it? So very good, very good. Okay, let's talk about aspect because in terms of meaning, other than the actual meaning of the verb itself, the issue of aspect is what participles are all about, okay? Outside of the indicative system, any notion of time almost completely goes away. In the advanced information, in one of these chapters, I'll tell you that there is a little bit of significance with time, but that's advanced information. Non-indicative verbal system is all about aspect, all right? And we have, in essence, three aspects, don't we? We have continuous, we have undefined, and we have completed. Now, knowing what you know, how do you think we are going to form the the continuous participle? How do we form the continuous participle? We form it with a present tense stem, all right? So the continuous participle is built on a present tense stem. Okay, if you wanted to have the undefined participle, what tense stem are you going to form it on? Well, it's going to be formed on an unaugmented aorist, isn't it? All right. And if you wanted to have a completed aspect participle, what tense stem are you going to use? You're going to use the perfect. Okay. Now, most people call these the present participle, the aorist participle, and the perfect participle. And I can understand why. It helps you understand how the participle is actually formed, all right? But I don't like that nomenclature because it's too easy for a first-year student to think that a present participle indicates an action occurring in present time, and it doesn't, all right? That has almost nothing to do with the meaning of the participle. So I have suggested that we change nomenclature. I don't know if teachers are picking it up or not, but the continuous participle is built off the present tense stem and indicates a continuous ongoing action. The undefined participle is built on an unaugmented aorist tense stem and it indicates an undefined action. And the completed participle is built on the perfect tense stem and it indicates a completed action, an action that was completed with ongoing consequences. All right. So that's the basic genius of the participial system in Greek. Okay. Important chart, important grid to get down. Okay, let's talk a little bit about translating. And as you might guess, because a participle is a verbal adjective, there's two basic uses of the participle, and therefore there's two basic ways to translate it. Now, I guess I should say up front, there's one simple way to translate a participle. Stick an ing on it. Okay, I mean, what you can do is you translate in the Greek, you see the participle, you see what the verb is, you stick an ing on it, and it may be rough English, but you can get through the sentence. Now, if you want to fine-tune that a bit, you may need to come back and reevaluate, is the thrust on this participle on its verbal aspect or on its adjectival nature, I should say. And those are the two basic ways to translate participles. Ing is the simple, and if this is a hard chapter for you, just say, I'm just going to use ing for now, okay? All right. But in terms of fine-tuning your translation a bit, you will find that a participle can be emphasizing its verbal nature or its adjectival nature. And if it's emphasizing its verbal nature, you'll normally end up with an ing form that functions in English kind of like an adverbial phrase or clause or something. If you had, for example, while studying for his Greek exam, Ian fell asleep. See, the participle is studying, and if this were in Greek, the while would be an adverb. But there you're pressing the adverbial nature of the participle. Ian is an old student of mine and a good friend, but he didn't necessarily fall asleep, but he got into this illustration. All right. Ian fell asleep. What was he doing when he fell asleep? Well, he was studying for his exam. You can feel the adverbial nature. But you can also sometimes feel more the adjectival nature. And so you could say, the book lying open on the windowsill belongs to Kathy. Kathy's Ian's wife, and also one of my students. They met in Greek class, but that's another story. Anyway, the book lying on the windowsill. See, lying, there's your participle. And when the adjectival nature of the participle is being stressed, again, you can just use the ing form, but you may eventually want to turn it into some kind of relative clause or something. The book that is lying on the windowsill, or which is, or something like that. But again, the basic way to translate a participle is stick an ing on it. And what you're going to find, though, that is if it's functioning more adverbially, the ing is going to work great. If it's functioning more adjectively, you may want to turn it into some kind of relative clause or something, okay? All right. Now, I should say that the form of the participle doesn't change, all right? There's not one form of the participle if it's adverbial and another form of the participle if it's more adjectival. It's exactly the same form. This is just a distinction of context and what fits the sentence you're translating, okay? All right. Okay, let's move back a bit to formation issues, and I just want to make sure that some of this is clear. Participles are verbal adjectives. Let's talk about the verbal side. Because they're verbal adjectives, they're going to have tense. And so we're going to have participles that are present and aorist or perfect. Okay, in other words, we're going to have participles that are stressing a continuous aspect or an undefined aspect or the completed aspect. They will be built on the present and on the unaugmented aorist and on the perfect tense stems. All right, so you have luantes, there's your present, lusantes, there's your undefined or your aorist, and lelucates, there's your completed or your perfect, okay? So on the verbal side of a participle, they're going to have tense. And also on the verbal side of the participle, they're going to have voice. In other words, a participle can be active, middle, passive, or deponent. And the way a Greek is going to distinguish active from passive, let's say, is that there's going to be different participle morphemes, okay? The nu tau and the omicron tau are active participle morphemes, men, mu epsilon nu, and then you're going to, because it's going to be second or first declension form, you need a vowel at the end, so mena or mene. That's going to be how you indicate a passive participle, okay? So you have a kuon test, that nu tau tells you that this is a present active participle. But if you came across a form, a kuamenoi, that men, or the mena, I guess actually, would be telling you that this is a middle passive participle. When it comes to the issue of deponency, remember that deponency is an issue of tense stem, not anything else. And so if a verb, it's certainly not an issue of whether it's an indicative or non-indicative. So if you have a verb like erchomai, you know that it's deponent in the present. That means it's going to be present. It's going to be deponent in the present indicative. It's going to be deponent in the present participle, okay? So if you come across the form erchomenoi, okay, there's the men. That tells you that it's a participle. And so you're going to see this as a present, but it's from erchomai, so this is a present deponent participle, nominative plural masculine, okay? From erchomai, meaning coming or going. So that's the verbal side, the tense and the voice. Pretty straightforward, isn't it? Switching over to the adjectival side, what's going to determine the case number and gender of a participle? And again, this isn't new grammar. This is old grammar reapplied in a new situation. So you don't make this hard. What determines the case number and gender of any adjective? The word it modifies, right? Okay. So what determines the case number and gender of a participle? The word it modifies. Now remember, in English, it's an issue of proximity. But in Greek, it's going to be an issue of the case ending that's being used, whether it's nominative or accusative, whether it's singular, plural, masculine, feminine. All those are the linkage methods that Greek uses to connect a participle to the word that it's modifying. Now, again, what's nice about this is that linkage tells you who's doing the action of the participle. All right. Now, okay, having said that, and that's the difference between English and Greek. Think of the sentence, the man eating the chocolate cake is my brother. What would be the case number and gender of eating? Well, it would be the word that it's modifying. What word is eating modify if this were in Greek? What would be modifying man? Well, man is anthropos, so it's singular masculine. And in the sentence, man is the subject, so it's nominative. So, how would you determine the case number and gender of the participle eating? Well, since anthropos, man, is going to be nominative singular masculine, then the participle eating has to be nominative singular masculine. So they're verbal adjectives. That's what you have to remember. Okay, let me change the illustration a bit. If he saw the man studying koine. Okay, he saw the man studying koine. What's going to be the case number and gender of studying? Well, it's going to go back to man, so it's going to be masculine singular again. But in this illustration, man is the direct object, And so the participle studying has to be in the accusative, right? Because man's going to be in the accusative. So again, just think adjectives. It'll all make sense. Now, one of the things that a participle doesn't have is a subject. In fact, outside the indicative system, verbs don't have subjects. But because of the case number and gender linkage, you can see the word that the participle is modifying. Well, that tells you who's doing the action of the participle. Again, assuming the participle is an active participle. So that linkage, in essence, tells you the subject, but it's not technically the subject, but it's telling you who's doing the action of the participle, okay? So if you had the sentence, he saw her while studying, okay, in English, it's the her who's doing the studying. But in Greek, if you said he saw her while studying, studying could be masculine, telling you that it's the he that's doing it. And so while technically he is not the subject of the participle studying, it's he who's doing the action of the participle. It's he who's doing the studying. Okay? Catch all that? All right. Okay. Hey, we're almost done. So hopefully you're not too overwhelmed by this. Odds and ends. Odds and ends number one is that Greek participles take modifiers, okay? They can take direct objects. They can take adverbs. They can take prepositional phrase. They can take lots of different things to fill out the meaning of the participle. And so when it comes to translating participles, you put your arms around the participial phrase, a slash before the participle, a slash at the end of all the modifiers, and you view that as a unit, okay? That's really important to do. Really important to do that. Participles, because in Greek, participial phrases can get pretty long. I mean, the writers can keep adding on modifiers, so you really want to get into that habit of doing that. Second odds and end has to do with negation. The basic rule is this. We use omicron upsilon, to negate an indicative verb, okay? But outside of the indicative system, the negation is may, mu eta. Okay, so if we're going to say not studying, it's going to be may. And this will hold true for all the other non-indicative moods, okay? Imperatives and infinitives and whatnot. So the negation of participles is may, not oo. And that actually is a really cool hint. You'll be reading along and you may not recognize that something's a participle, but you're going to see a may and you go, uh-oh. What's a may doing there? There's got to be a non-indicative form somewhere around here. And you go looking for your participle, okay? So that's a very important clue. Thirdly, in terms of parsing, and you've already done this with me, there's 8 things that you're going to tell your teacher when you parse a participle. And my recommendation is to start on the left side of the participle with its verbal characteristics, and then go to the right side of the participle and cover its adjectival characteristics. Your teacher may want you to do it a different way, but that's how I do it. That's how it's laid out in the workbook. So it's not that nice and neat, but that's basically what I'm doing. Okay, so you see a participle, and you're going to want to know what its tense is, and then you're going to want to know what its voice is. And then the next slot is actually the mood slot, and participles are not technically moods, but that's where you say participle. And then it's case number, gender, lexical form, and then the meaning of the inflected form, okay? So you have ukuantas, okay? What is that? Well, that is, it's from akuo. The new tau tells you it's active. You can see you're in the present tense system. So this is a present or a continuous active participle. It is a genitive singular, either masculine or neuter, from akuo, meaning hearing, okay? So that's how you parse these things. Well, how was that? How are you doing? That's all there is to the chapter. That's all there is actually to the grammar for all of participles. In chapter 27, we're going to look at continuous or present participles used adverbially. In chapter 28, we're going to look at undefined or aorist participles used adverbially. In chapter 29, we're going to look at participles being used adjectivally. And in chapter 30, we're going to look at perfect participles or completed participles. Again, those are all issues of form. And in this chapter, we got all the meaning, significance, and translation down. Pretty good, huh? All right. So you should feel pretty comfortable with yourself if you've gotten this far, okay? Good. Well, let's go to the summary and make sure this is all clear. Participles are ing words. End of the chapter. Well, not quite. Participles are verbal adjectives. Because they are verbal adjectives, they have tense, present, aorist, and perfect, and they have voice, active, middle, passive, and deponent. But participles are also verbal adjectives, and so they have case, number, and gender. The primary significance of a participle is its aspect. The continuous participle is built on the present tense stem and indicates a continuous action. The undefined participle is built on an unaugmented aorist tense stem and indicates an undefined action. And the completed participle is built on the perfect tense stem and indicates a completed action that has present consequences. In terms of the basic formation of the participle, they're formed with a verb and then the participle morpheme, sometimes with a connecting vowel between them, and then case endings. And as far as odds and ends are concerned, participles can have modifiers. They're negated by may, and when you parse them, you tell the teacher 8 things about them. Tense, voice, that it's a participle, case, number, gender, lexical form, and inflected meaning. Okay, there you go. It wasn't too hard, was it? And that's all the grammar you really need to know for 5 complete chapters, okay? Now, there's no vocabulary for this chapter, so you get a break today and go get a little extra sleep or something. But just when you go to sleep tonight, just tell yourself 2 things. Participles are ing words. They are verbal adjectives. They have tense and voice, they're built on a tense stem of a verb, and they have case, number, and gender. There you go. Have a good night. See you tomorrow. Well, now that you know all the basic grammar there is with participles, we learned it back in chapter 26, we're going to take what you've learned and we're going to apply it in specific situations. In chapter 7, we're going to be looking at present adverbial participles. Participles built on the present tense stem that are adverbial in their function. Okay, so we'll take what we learned in 26 and we'll apply it here. Well, let's start with some review. Present adverbial participles. These are participles, as I said, that are built on the present tense stem of the verb, and they will always indicate a continuous and ongoing action. That's their aspect. And what you're going to find is in translating these things that you're not always going to be able to get that nuance of the continual aspect into your translation. That's why God gave the church preachers and teachers. Okay, translation can't do it all. You have to have people who know how to explain this stuff. But anyway, so you'll have trouble making your translations always continuous. But you can know that the participle that's built on the present tense stem is always indicating a continuous and ongoing action. Okay, all right. And also, we are going to be looking at participles that are functioning adverbially. Now, how do I know all these participles function adverbially? Is there a clue in the form of the participle? No. All these participles look alike, whether they're adverbial or adjectival. I just artificially went through the Bible and pulled out just adverbial illustrations for chapter 27, okay? So we're going to be focusing on adverbials now. We'll do adjectivals later on, okay? So we're going to be looking at participles that are functioning adverbially. And what that means is that the force of the participle is going to be directed right at the verb. Now, these participles still have to have case, number, and gender. There has to be someone doing the participle, right? Participle still has to modify something. But so these participles will have a noun they modify, agree with it in case, number, and gender. But the thrust of the participle is going to be direct, its meaning is going to be directed at the verb in the sentence. Now, here's a really, really important clue. All adverbial participles are anarthrous. They're not immediately preceded by the definite article. Now, that's not going to mean a whole lot to you now, but when you get to adjectival participles, it's going to mean everything in the world, okay? Because they are articular. They have the article with them. So as you work through the workbook in this chapter and in the next, make sure that you really notice that the adverbial use of the participle is always anarthrous. When it comes to how do you translate these things, again, stick an ing on it and see if it makes sense, all right? And what I often do, especially if I'm having trouble translating a verse, I'll put an ing on it. I'll get through the verse. I'll say, does it all make sense? Yeah, okay, it all makes sense to me. Then I'll come back and I'll say, okay, can I say it with better English? As something better than an ing. And what you're going to find out is that adverbial participles often can be translated with some kind of adverbial clause. In other words, they're going to be telling you when or why something else happens. And you're going to be able to, and I'll talk about this in a bit, you're going to be able to, for example, put while in front of some of these participles if it fits the context. So take a word like eat, that's the indicative. First time through as a participle, you say eating. And then when you come back, you're going to say, well, is there a smoother way to say it in English? Maybe, does while eating fit? Yeah, it really does. Okay. And you'll be able to put the while in there. The other thing that, in terms of review, is that, remember, participles can be active or passive. If a participle is active, it means that the word that it's modifying is doing the action of the participle. And if the participle is passive, it means the word that the participle is modifying is receiving the action of the participle. Okay, so active, passive, and we have middles and deponents as well. And finally, for review, again, let's just remind ourselves, how does the participle, and in this case, the present participle, put itself, how's it put together, okay? The present participle is comprised of the present tense stem of the verb, a connecting vowel, and then a participle morpheme and case endings. And so you get a form like pistuantes. The new tau is one of the participle morphemes. That's the present active participle. Usa is actually what happens to new tau when it goes into the feminine. We'll talk about that in a bit. Luusai is a present active participle, in this case feminine. And then luamenas, the men, is your middle passive participle morpheme. So this is a present middle passive participle. But the point that I wanted you to see is that in very general terms, a present participle is formed with the present tense stem of the verb, a connecting vowel, the participle morpheme, and then the appropriate case endings, okay? All right. How is the present or continuous participle formed? It's formed with the present tense stem, a connecting vowel, and then the appropriate participle morpheme and case endings. And you get a form like pistuantes, from pistuo. The omicron is a connecting vowel. The morpheme, in this case, is new tau. And then you have the appropriate case endings. And by the way, on this whole case endings thing, there's nothing new here to learn. Just take the rules that you learned before. Okay, if it's a new tau, that makes it a consonantal stem, right? And so it's going to take third declension endings. If the participle morpheme ends in an omicron, it'll be second declension. And if it ends in an alpha or eta, it'll be first declension, right? Okay, so in terms of case endings, there's nothing new here to learn. Just reapply the old rules. Okay, so you have pistuantes. Then you have luusai. What's that? Well, one of the things that you're going to see is that the new tau, when it goes into the feminine, shifts into a first declension. In fact, all feminine participles are first declension. You can't often say always in a language, but you can here. All feminine participles are first declension. And so you're going to have a significant shift from new tau to whatever its feminine form is going to be. But anyway, luusai is a present active participle. It's a feminine. What's luamenas? Well, the participle morpheme is men, and then it's either going to have an omicron or an eta because it's 212. This is the middle passive morpheme, so luamenas is a present middle passive participle. Okay, that was all by way of review, and I wanted just to make sure that the overall picture is clear in your minds, okay? All right. In this chapter, we're going to look at present active, and then we're going to look at present middle passive participles. So let's start with present active. How do you form a present or a continuous active participle? You have the present tense stem, the connecting vowel, the active participle morpheme, and then the appropriate case endings. The active morpheme is new tau, and so you end up with a form like pistuantes. Now, before we get into the paradigm, I want to emphasize something you learned back in chapter 10 or 11, and that is the word pos. Remember that? Pos is the word for each, every, or in the plural all, and is from the root pont. And I said that was a really important paradigm to learn. Here's why. Pos is the paradigm for the participle, okay? Because the participle is new tau, and so the root of pos ends in new tau. And so what you saw with pos, you're going to see in the participle. So if you're not sure on the participle from pos, you may want to go back and take a look at it before you continue here. But anyway, let's take a look at the paradigm and see what this participle looks like. Let's start with a masculine column. What's gone on there? Well, this is a third declension form, right? Nu tau, that's a consonant. There's no case ending that's used. You remember Rule 8, tau's don't like to be at the end of the word and they drop off. And then what's happened is the connecting vowel omicron is lengthened to an omega and you get luon. But after that, it's really easy, isn't it? It's luontas, luonti, luonta. Now on the video, I'm not going to be showing you the whole plural form of the paradigm just to save screen space, but I am going to be showing you the dative plural. Because the rule is for third declension that whatever happens in the nominative singular also happens in the dative plural. So the dative plural form of this participle is luusi. Well, what happened? Well, the case ending is sigma iota. Nu taus drop out before sigmas. You remember the rules. And the connecting vowel omicron has lengthened to the diphthong u, and you get luusi with a nu movable. Now that looks like something, doesn't it? What does it look like? Well, it looks like the third person plural, present active indicative, right? Of lua, lues, lue, luamen, lueta, luusi. And you may think, oh, how will I keep them separate? Actually, you're almost never going to confuse these two forms. The third person plural, the indicative, and the dative plural of the participle. There's always going to be some kind of contextual clue or something telling you what's what. So don't worry about it. It's pretty simple. But you do need to know what's happening. Okay, let's go back and look at the feminine. Well, as I said, when nu tau is your participle morpheme, it's going to be a 3-1-3 adjective form. And therefore, it's got to shift into the first declension for the feminine, and nu tau is always going to change into something significantly different in the feminine. And in the case of the present active, it's gone to usa. But after that, it's perfectly regular, isn't it? You have the alpha eta shift, but no big deal. Go over to the neuter, and the tau is dropped off because there's no case ending, but the omicron didn't lengthen, and after that is what you would expect. Now, I went over some of those changes pretty quickly, but I wasn't concerned about them, and here's why. If you try to memorize all these paradigms, you're going to go nuts. I mean, there are so many forms for the participles. And what I have found is that if you memorize just 6 forms of each participle, that's basically all you need to know. I'm going to ask you to learn the nominative and the genitive singular, all 3 genders for each participle. So 6 forms for the present active, 6 forms for the present middle passive, 6 forms for the aorist active, that kind of thing. Because what I have found is that if you just know these 6 forms, the rest of the paradigm is easy to figure out. And some people have struggled with just the 6. They want the dative plural included. And if you struggle with the dative plural, you may want to just write them into the book as well. But I'm only going to ask you to memorize these 6 forms. And the reason for this is that it's the nominative singular that's going to give us trouble. We've seen that, right? In third declension nouns, it was the sarx to sarkos. I was like, well, how did you get from sarx to sarkos? And I taught you the rules, but basically if you memorize sarx and that the root is sark, then you've memorized the really hard part and everything else just makes sense, right? Well, that's the same kind of thing that's going on here. That if you memorize the nominative and the genitive singular, that handles most of the awkward constructions, and everything else is just simple to learn. So what I'm going to ask you to learn for the present active participle is on, usa, on, ontas, uses, ontas, okay? This 6 forms approach is the best way I know to keep you from memorizing tons and tons of forms. So anyway, just learn those 6, okay? All right, before we get out of the active, there's just a couple of odds and ends I need to cover. The first is contract verbs. Contract verbs, when they occur as participles, are absolutely regular. The final contract vowel will contract with the connecting vowel, as everything should be, so there aren't any surprises there. But the other thing you need to look at is the paradigm for ami when it occurs as a participle. It's a very easy paradigm, and I'm not sure you should necessarily memorize it, but take a look at it. Basically, what it is the connecting vowel, the participle morpheme, the case ending, always with a smooth breathing. Okay, that's all that the participle of ami is. So it goes on, usa, on, ontas, uses, ontas. Usi, usais, usi in the dative plural. So no big surprises there. Okay, so much for the present active. Let's go and check out the present passive. It's much easier than the present active is. Okay, how do you form the present or the continuous middle passive participle? You form it with the present tense stem, a connecting vowel, and then the middle passive participle morpheme and the appropriate case endings. The participle morpheme is men, mu epsilon nu. And if it's going to be a masculine or a neuter, it's going to be a second declension, so it'll have an omicron. If it's going to be a feminine, it's going to be a first declension, and it's going to have an eta. So in this case, it's luomenoi. You look at the paradigm, and it's hardly worth the trouble. It's so blissfully regular, luomenos, luomene, luomenon, and all the way down. No surprises, 212. And when you get to the 6 forms, I'm going to ask you to memorize amenas, amene, amenon, amenu, amenes, amenu. I mean, you don't really even have to memorize all 6 forms, do you? Just if you know amenas, everything else is easy. So perhaps your teacher will lighten your memory load and say, just learn amenas. But anyway, amenas, amene, amenon, amenu, amenes, amenu. It's no big deal. All right. The 6 forms are some of the most important things that you need to memorize for participles, but there are 2 other charts you need to know. In a sense, the participle morpheme chart corresponds to the case ending chart, okay? But this is a much shorter chart, though, but it's the chart of what the true morphemes are. And the reason this is so important is that participles can often get pretty long, and the morphemes need to jump out at you. They need to cry out, I'm a participle, okay? So you need to really know the morphemes well. So that's what this chart is all about. I'm going to add one more line to it later on. But for now, this is the bulk of the paradigm and all that you do know at this point. The participle morpheme chart tells you that there's 2 basic morphemes that you've learned. The nu tau morpheme is used in all active participles, and it is used in the aorist passive participle. Now, nu tau is going to be a 3-1-3 adjectival form. The feminine is going to be first declension, and as I said, the nu tau, therefore, is always going to change to something significantly different in the feminine. In fact, what some people prefer to do to this chart is to add another column and add in what the feminine forms are like. You know, what's the feminine form of nu tau in the present and in the other parts of the participle. If you want to add them in, that's fine. I've never really found, because of the 6 forms, I never found it necessary to do it, but you may want to do it. The other morpheme is men with the appropriate vowel, either omicron if it's a masculine or neuter, or eta if it's a first declension. The men morpheme is used in all middle participles, so that would be the future and the aorist, and it's used in all middle passive participles, which would be the present and the perfect. Okay, that's it for the formation of the present participle. Now, there were some new things that you had to learn in the chapter, but for the most part, they were things that you had learned in chapter 26, and you had just applied it now in this chapter. But again, there's enough there to keep you busy for a while, isn't there? All right. Let's move from formation on to the whole issue of how do you translate these participles. Participles are not like indicative verbs. For the most part, you could kind of translate an indicative verb as you were parsing it. You know, you could see the person and the number. You can say, we are, and then look at the verb and see what it means. And we are loosing, and you could kind of translate it as you go. You can't do that with participles. With participles, you have to slow down. You have to take a deep breath. Because with participles, there's 3 things that you have to know about it. And until you know those 3 things, you can't start your translation, okay? So just take your time with participles, slow down. And here are the 3 questions that you have to ask of a participle. First of all, what's your aspect? You have to find out whether it's continuous, undefined, or completed. Now, of course, in this chapter, that's kind of silly because they're all going to be continuous, but you need to get into the habit of looking at the participle and saying, okay, this participle is built on the present tense stem. It's continuous. Okay, I'm going to try to have a continuous translation. Again, you're not always going to be able to have it continuous, but you will try to have it continuous. Secondly, you're going to have to look at the voice. Is the participle active, or is it middle passive, and is it deponent? Okay, you need to ask those questions. And then thirdly, you need to figure out what the actual verb means. What does luo mean or pistuo mean, okay? So you have to get the meaning of the verb. And probably in all of that, you will want to be able to find the head noun, the noun that the participle is modifying, because that will help you translate it. You have to do all three of those things. And it may be good at this point also to do a fourth thing, and that is to identify the head noun. What word is the participle modifying? You may need that in order to do your translation. So you do this initial work. Only after you've done all of these things can you start the translation of the participle. And some people get frustrated at this point. They don't know how to say it in English. And my encouragement to you is you just got to think grammatically, okay? You got to say, okay, how do I make it continuous in English? How do I make it active in English? Okay, it's modifying this word. This word is masculine singular, or it's plural, or something like that. And you've got to think through, and the word means I believe, and you have to think grammatically and go through all of that. And then as you think grammatically, then the translation will come to you, okay? But the point I'm trying to make is you can't translate as you go with participles. You have to stop and you have to answer all these questions first, obviously knowing case, number, and gender as well. And then you can start your translation process, okay? All right. So when you get to the actual translation, the best advice is just stick an ing onto it. Even if it's really rough English, in terms of style, just put an ing under the participle, translate the whole verse, and then make sure you got all your bits and pieces there, everything, all your ducks are in a row, okay, and it makes sense. If it's an active participle, you use ing. If it's a passive participle, you use being, right? You use being and the past participle form of the English verb, the third principal part. So, for example, in the indicative, it would be eat. And then your first time through, if it's a participle, you would say eating. And then or if it's passive, you would say being eaten. All right? So that's the basic process you go through in translating the participle. ing if it's active, being if it's passive. Now, I'm going to have two other categories here for you. And these are a little advanced, but they're really easy and they're fun. And so I stuck them in the book, okay? But again, especially if you're having real trouble with participles, just listen to me quickly, and you may want to come back and later on and pay better attention to me. What you're going to find is that adverbial participles are often temporal. In other words, they're going to be telling you something about the time of the main verb, okay? So if you were to make up a sentence like, while Paul is preaching, Eutychus falls out of the window. All right. So what about the falling? Well, it happened when, so there's your temporal participle. Eutychus fell out when Paul was preaching. A lot of participles are temporal. And what you're going to find is that you can add the word while into your translation. And again, the form of the participle isn't going to be different. This is a totally contextual thing. You'll use the ing, you'll finish the sentence, you go, oh, that's kind of rough. Well, actually it's saying, the participle is saying is while the participle is happening, then this is what happened. Oh, hey, while fits. While makes sense. It's better English. So you're free to put while in. It's kind of like a key word with a case system that you can kind of think of while as a key word for a present participle. Present participles are also used causally. In other words, they're used to give a description. It's because he was studying so hard, Ian fell asleep. All right? Was studying. There's your participle. And the participle is telling you the cause of the falling asleep. It's because he was studying so hard, Ian fell asleep. So the first time through, you would say, studying hard, Ian fell asleep. Okay, well, it doesn't sound good. I can understand what it means. But it's because he was studying hard that he fell asleep. Okay? So because is another kind of key word for adverbial participles. By the way, in terms of translation, the most important thing is if it's active, stick an ing. If it's passive, do being in the third principal part of the English verb. And then if context allows it, and if it helps the context, then you can make it temporal or causal by adding in while or because. Okay? All right. Very good. That's it for the chapter, so let's summarize what we've learned. We've learned the present or continuous participle. The continuous participle is formed with a present tense form of the verb, a connecting vowel, an active or a middle passive participle morpheme, and the appropriate case endings. In terms of its meaning, the present participle is always continuous. In this chapter, we're going to be seeing participles that are adverbial in their thrust. They're still going to modify a noun or a pronoun. That's what's going to determine their case number and gender. But the thrust of the meaning of the participle is going to be directed towards the verb. And the important clue to identify the adverbial use of a participle is that they're always anarthrous. We began to learn the participle morpheme chart. The morpheme nu tau is used on all active and all aorist passive participles. It's a 3-1-3 formation, and so when it goes to the feminine, the nu tau will be significantly changed. And we learned the men morpheme, either with an omicron or an eta. It's the participle morpheme that's used in all middle forms and in all middle passive forms. It's a 2-1-2 formation and blissfully regular. Okay, you remember that I told you there's a couple of charts we need to learn? Well, we have with participles something that corresponds to the master verb chart. Now, it's not nearly as long as the master verb chart, but it is as important as the master verb chart. It is the master participle chart is the way that I will help you see how all the pieces go together, how all the triggers go together in the formation of your different participles, okay? So this is a very important chart. I'll be adding to it every chapter, and you'll need to memorize this thing exactly. So how do you form the continuous participle? Well, you can see the columns are tense voice, reduplication, stem, either a tense formative or a connecting vowel, the morpheme that's used, and then what it looks like in the nominative plural. So how do you form a present active participle? You start with a present tense stem, a connecting vowel, and the nu tau morpheme that goes to usa in the feminine, and you get legantes. Then how do you form the present middle passive participle? Well, you have the present tense stem, connecting vowel, and then mena, mene, and you get legaminoi. Now, there wasn't enough room on the screen to add the 6 forms for each participle, but those 6 forms are part of the master participle chart, and so you need to be able to write those as well. Okay, so the 6 forms for the present active participle are on, usa, on, antas, uses, antas, and the 6 forms for the present middle passive are amanas, amane, amanan, amanu, amanes, amanu. Okay, very good. And we saw that when it comes to translating these participles, you have to do a little bit of preparation. You have to figure out the participle's aspect, voice, and meaning, and only then can you start the translation. If it's an active participle, you'll use ing. If it's a passive, you'll use being in the third principal part. And if contextually it makes sense, you can put in while and because. Okay, that's it for the chapter, and we'll get on to our vocabulary, and then I'm going to come back and tell you something at the end. Anabino. I go up, come up. Archierus, archiereos, ha. Chief priest, high priest. Dexios, dexia, dexion. Right. Dua. 2. Heteros, hetera, heteron. Other, another, different. Euangelizo. I bring good news, preach. Theoreo. I look at, behold. Hierosalima, ta or hey. Jerusalem. Kathemai. I sit down, live. Katabino. I go down, come down. Who? Where? Parakaleo. I call, urge, exhort, comfort. Peitho, I persuade. Trace, tria. 3. So much for vocabulary. But before we get on to the workbook, I do want to talk a bit about the discussion that's in the advanced information section. This was one of the harder decisions I had in BBG because the information that ended up in the advanced information section is critical information you have to know. The problem is that what I found is that most students have found the day zone trouble to be sufficient. There's enough to learn in this chapter without something extra. And so I put the discussion in the advanced information section, but if you don't memorize it now, you're going to have to memorize it sometime. And it may be that your teacher wants you to memorize it now, so be sure to check with him or her about that. But even if you don't have to memorize it now, I really want you to read through the advanced information just so you're aware of it, okay? This is the whole issue of relative time. Do you remember back when I started talking about participles? I said that outside the indicative system, that time is almost irrelevant. Well, this is the almost part of that, all right? The present participle does not indicate absolute time. The present participle does not indicate an action that occurs in the present. An aorist participle does not necessarily indicate an action that occurred in the past. That's part of why I don't like the terminology present participle and aorist participle. They don't indicate absolute time. But a participle does have relative time. The time of the participle is relative to the time of the main verb. Let me give you the full definition of what a present participle is. The continuous participle, the present participle, is the participle that is built on a present tense stem with a verb. It always conveys a continuous aspect, and it indicates an action occurring at the same time as the time of the main verb. So the present participle is built off the present tense stem, indicates a continuous action, and the action of the present participle is occurring at the same time as the time of the main verb. In other words, strictly speaking, when you go to translate participles, you have to stop and you have to go find the main verb. You have to see the time of the main verb, and then you can come back and translate the participle. Well, day zone trouble is sufficient. At this point, this is probably too much for you. But let me give you an example. If you had a sentence something like, while studying, I watch the clock. Dumb sentence, but while studying, I watch the clock. All right. Watch is present, and so the participle has to be in present time as well. So you'd say, while I am studying, I watch the clock. Okay, or while I am studying, I am watching the clock. The participle has to be at the same time as the main verb. But what's going to happen if you take that main verb and put it in the past? What if watch goes to watched? Well, the participle has to go into past time as well. It's still continuous, but it has to be a past time continuous. So the present participle is translated as the past continuous. So you would say, while I was studying, I watched the clock. Okay, and that may be more than you want to know right now, and that's also why I put it at the end of the video lecture. But technically speaking, the present participle indicates an action that occurs at the same time as the main verb. And so you have to know the time of the main verb before you can translate the participle. So, again, if that's too much, just stick an ing onto the end of the participle and have fun, all right? But read through the advanced information, and then at some time you'll need to come back and to take this whole issue of relative time into consideration in your translation. Okay? All right. Well, go have fun with your workbook. Well, welcome to chapter 29. And in chapter 29, we're going to be learning about adjectival participles. Now, in the previous chapters, we've learned about adverbial participles. So today we're going to look at adjectival participles. Now, the good news is there's no new forms to learn. Yay! In other words, whether a participle is adverbial or adjectival, the form of the participle is identical. So there's no new charts, no new paradigms. It's just a little bit of grammar. But let me emphasize, what is a participle? A participle is a verbal adjective, right? So we've been looking at the adverbial functioning of participles, but now we're going to look at the second half, the adjectival side. And basically, you already know just about all the participial grammar in this chapter already. Why? Because you already know the adjectival grammar. I mean, if you don't know adjectives, then you wouldn't get to chapter 29. But what I want you to do in this chapter is to take what you know about adjectives and then move it over to participles when they're functioning adjectively. And if you make that transition, you'll find that this is one of the easiest chapters in the entire textbook. Okay? So participles are verbal adjectives. They can function adverbially, last couple chapters. They can function adjectively. In fact, as I like to say, participles can do anything that an adjective can do, and generally better. And there's more meaning in a participle. And so it's a richer expression, even when it's modifying something. So anyway, verbal adjectives. Okay, how are adjectival participles going to function? Well, how do adjectives function? Well, we have three ways, don't we? Adjectives can function as an attributive, as a regular, the good teacher. Good's an attributive adjective. And adjectives can function substantively, as if they are nouns, right? The good, the bad, and the ugly. Now, back in the chapter on adjectives, I think it's chapter 9, we also saw a third kind of an adjective, or we said that adjectives can occur in the predicate position. It's pretty rare for a participle to occur in a predicate position, and we're not going to deal with those in first year Greek. So what we're going to look at is adjectives functioning as an attributive and as a substantive. So we're going to look at participles functioning as an attributive and as a substantive. Okay? So think of adjectives, attributive, substantival. So also adjectival participles can function as an attributive and as a substantive. Okay? In terms of the meaning of an adjectival participle or how you're going to translate them, I'd really encourage you just simply, when you see one of these participles, just stick ing on it and see if it makes sense. It may be that you'll need to clean up your English translation a little bit later on, but your first time through the sentence, you see the participle, just put ing on it and go from there. And you'll be surprised at how many times it actually is understandable English. Now, by the way, do not use the words while and after with adjectival participles. While and after are indications of temporal relationships that are only appropriate to adverbial participles. Okay, so while and after belong with adverbial. We're not going to use them with adjectival participles. Just stick an ing on it. I should also say that issues of aspect and relative time are less significant with adjectival participles, more significant with adverbial, less significant with adjectival. And in fact, if you're trying to look at aspect and relative time when it comes to an adjectival participle, you're going to find that it's almost impossible to bring it into English. Okay, English really struggles to handle that kind of information. So ing, no while and after, and aspect and relative time, not nearly as important. Okay? All right. If you have a participle functioning as an adjective, what's going to determine its case number and gender? Well, what determines the case number and gender of any adjective? Well, if the adjective is functioning as an attributive, the good teacher, then the adjective is going to agree with its head noun in case number and gender, right? Same thing with the participle. If you come across an adjectival participle that's functioning as an attributive, then it is going to agree with the noun it's modifying in case, number, and gender. No, nothing new to learn. Okay? Nothing new to learn here. But what if the adjectival participle is functioning as a substantive? What determines its case, number, and gender? Well, what determines the case, number, and gender of an adjective functioning substantively? Right, its case is determined by its function in the sentence. If the adjective functioning as a noun is the subject of the verb, it's going to be in the nominative. It's the direct object to be accusative, indirect object, dative, this kind of thing, right? So just like function works with determining the case of a substantival adjective, so also with participles. So if you have an adjectival participle that's functioning substantively, its case is going to be determined by its function in the sentence. What are you going to do about gender and number? Well, what happens with a substantival adjective? How do we determine, how do the speakers determine, I guess I should say, its gender and number? Well, it's by whatever it stands for, right? Same thing with the participle. So if you have a substantival participle, its case is determined by its function in the sentence, its gender and number by whatever it stands for. Now, there is another way to look at substantival participles. So I'm just going to mention this on the side and check with your teacher as whether he or she wants you to do it the way I've done it in the book or this way. But there are some people that like to think of substantival participles as actually attributive participles that are modifying some unexpressed word. Now, if you think of a substantival participle that way, then its case, number, and gender is going to be determined by that unexpressed word. So if you have a participle saying, well, maybe the unexpressed word is gune, is woman, and so the participle is going to be feminine singular because it's going to gune. That's just another way to think of substantival participles as actually attributives modifying an unexpressed word. But it works. It works either way at this point. But check with your teacher. And just like as we saw with adjectives, so also if an adjectival participle is functioning as a noun, you're probably going to have to add in some extra words. You can't just say speaking. Let's say you're reading along and you see lagone, and it goes, okay, it's from lego, it means to say, it's a participle. So I'm going to say saying or speaking. You go, oh, wait a minute, that doesn't work at all. This is functioning as a noun. You got to add in a word, right? The one speaking, or he who is speaking, or she who is speaking, or they who are speaking, whatever fits the form or the participle in the context, you're probably going to have to add in some extra words. So, case, number, and gender, just like an adjective, whether it's attributive or substantival. Okay? All right. You've probably been asking then, okay, since the form of the participle is the same, whether it's adverbial or adjectival, how do I know? Well, we're at that point now. How do you, when you look at a participle, know whether it's functioning adverbially or adjectivally? Okay, that's the question. And there are two basic rules or two things we look at to make this decision. The first is by far the most important. The number one thing you look at, and when you're translating a participle, trying to decide whether it's adverbial or adjectival, is the article. As I've said multiple times, the article is your friend, right? I'm sure you believe me by now. And when it comes to this decision, adverbial, adjectival, the article is almost everything, okay? So let me give you the rules. An adverbial participle is always anarthrous. If you look back through your workbook, the last couple chapters, all your participles have been anarthrous. There's no article immediately in front of it. Okay, so the rule is adverbial participles are always anarthrous. Adjectival participles are usually articular. Okay, so all the words are important. Adverbial participles are always anarthrous. There's never going to be an article right in front of an adverbial participle. Adjectival participles, not exclusively, but usually are articular. That's how you make the decision. Now, you need to know this rule really well. So let's flip it on a reverse to make sure it's clear. Let's say you're reading along and you come across a participle and it's anarthrous. Well, that means it is probably adverbial, right? But if you're reading along and you see a participle and it's articular, then it must be adjectival. Okay, makes sense? So you need to learn those rules. That, I guess one rule is you have to learn it both ways, okay? Adverbials always, anarthrous, adjectival are usually articular. If you have an anarthrous participle, it's usually going to be adverbial. If it is articular, it must be adjectival. Okay? So the number one thing we look at in deciding whether a participle is adverbial or adjectival is the presence or absence of the article. The second thing we look at is simply context. And context is going to become important when the participle is anarthrous. Because while an anarthrous participle is usually adverbial, it doesn't have to be adverbial. So what you do is you look at the context and say what fits. And it may sound like, oh, that's going to be really hard. It's not really. When you see these things in context, it's going to go, oh, well, it has to be adverbial or it has to be adjectival. It doesn't make any sense any other way. Okay? So the article and context are the two guides on this decision. Well, let's go to a slightly different scenario then. Let's say you decide that it's adjectival. Well, you have another decision to make, don't you? Because is this adjectival participle attributive or is it substantival? All right. If there's an article there, for example, and so you know it's adjectival, you still have to decide whether that adjectival participle is attributive, functioning like a regular adjective, or whether it's functioning as a noun. It actually is really easy to make this decision. And let me give you a couple of, actually 3 examples. And we're just going to walk our way through them. And you're going to see how your adjectival grammar is going to inform your participial grammar. This is actually pretty easy. Take a look at these. In this first one, you go ha anthropos, ha legon, to achlo estin. Obviously, the participle is legon. So we go, okay, what's the first thing I look at? Well, is it articular or anarthrous? Well, it's articular, isn't it? There's an article right in front of it. But look at the overall construction. It goes article, noun, article, participle. That's just the second attributive position, isn't it? Remember back in chapter 9, we learned it article, noun, article, adjective, but then I encouraged you to learn it article, noun, article, modifier, because lots of things can modify. Well, here you got a participle functioning obviously as an attributive form. So it's the man, the saying to the crowd is, it's not English, so we have to add in some extra words and say something like the man who is speaking to the crowd is. But obviously legon is giving an attribute of the anthropos, right? Second attributive position, no new grammar. Okay, look at the next example. Ha to achlo legon estin. The to the crowd speaking is. Oh, okay, obviously that's not English, but what are you going to do with this? Well, what you have is article, modifier, what? Participle. I mean, the only way you can translate this is to understand that ha legon is functioning substantively. And you've got a modifier right between the article and the participle. So the to the crowd speaking, well, the speaking to the crowd, well, still is in English. So you're going to have to add in some words. It's masculine, singular. So look at the context, and maybe it would be the man speaking to the crowd is, or the one speaking to the crowd is. Again, whatever fits the context. But you'll notice that all 4 of those words together, that participial phrase, is the subject of estin, right? The speaking to the crowd, okay, that person is. The one speaking to the crowd is. Go to the third example. Jesus' words. proseuchistha, pray, on behalf of ton, the diokanton. You don't know this word. It occurs less than 50 times. It's dioko, means to persecute. That's obviously the participle. Persecuting. Humas. Humas is accusative because it's the direct object of the participle. So you go, pray on behalf of the persecuting. Well, it's plural. Don't have a plural form in English for the. Can't say those. On behalf of the persecuting you, okay, make that into English. Pray for those persecuting, or those who are persecuting you. Okay, again, obviously, once you look at the context, you know that the participle is adjectival because it's preceded by the article, but it's functioning substantively. There's nothing for it to modify. It's genitive because of what? It's the object of the preposition hupera that takes the genitive. Pray for those who are persecuting you. Okay, that wasn't hard, was it? I mean, again, once you start seeing these things and think grammatically, make sure your adjectival grammar is clear. I'm sure it is. These things are pretty straightforward. Just stick your ing on it and go with it, okay? All right. Well, let's go to the summary, and then I'm going to come back and show you one other chart after the summary, okay? But here's what we've learned in this chapter. And I'm going to go back and pull in the last previous chapters here as well to make a summary over about 3 chapters. There are 2 kinds of participles, which you would expect from a verbal adjective. A participle can function adverbially. It's always going to be anarthrous if it's adverbial. Adverbial participles agree with the word doing the action of the participle in case, number, and gender, even though the thrust of the meaning of the participle is directed toward the verb. Adverbial participles are easily translated with ing. Perhaps if context allows it, you may want to add in a while if it's a present participle, or after if it's an aorist. And with adverbial participles, you want to try to bring out the aspect of the form if possible. However, there are also adjectival uses of participles. Adjectival participles are usually articular, but as an adjective, they can be functioning in 1 of 2 different ways. The adjectival participle can function as an attributive, in which case it's going to agree with the noun it modifies in case, number, and gender, and a simple ing normally is sufficient to translate these. But adjectival participles can also function substantively as nouns. In this case, just like with adjectives, the case is determined by its function in the sentence, the number and gender by what it's referring back to, and you will probably have to add in extra words to make this English in your translation. Okay, that's pretty straightforward, isn't it? Not a whole lot of work. What I want to do now is show you a chart. It's in the book. It's about a half a page. It's a pretty good sized chart. And it's labeled 7 questions you have to ask of any participle you meet, or something like that. And the thing that's hard about participles is that when you see them, you just can't make one decision and translate them. You actually have to make 7 decisions. And until you've made all 7 of those decisions, you can't translate these participles. So that's what makes participles a little more difficult. Now, having said that, this chart is it's a bit of a frustrating chart to me, because I'm always trying to simplify it. I just think this chart should be simpler. And in fact, as I have taught the book after I did this edition, I realized it's 7 questions. We may be able to ignore the first question. We may be able to get this down to 6 questions you ask of every participle. Check with your teacher what he or she wants you to do with this. But the problem is, every time I've tried to simplify it, other than dropping off the first question, every time I've gone to simplify this, the students have really struggled, and they get to a point and they're missing part of the equation in translating participles. So I've stuck with this chart because I've not found any way to make it simpler. If you can find a simpler way, let me know, okay? But I want to show you this chart to kind of bring all your participial grammar together. Now, before we get into the chart though, I got to really encourage you, especially if you're struggling, don't lose sight of the forest for the trees. We're going to get into the trees of 6 or 7 questions that we're going to ask. But remember, all you have to really remember, at least initially on participles, is ing. You're reading along, you see the form as a participle, you get its meaning, you put ing on it, and you finish out the sentence. Okay, do it that way. And then come back and say, okay, do I need to clean up this translation at all? So don't get lost in all the details of this chart. If you're having trouble, just use ing for now. But sooner or later, you're going to have to be able to go through these questions, okay? Well, here's the top half of the chart. And as I said, what I have always done is that when I first see a participle, I encourage students to ask, well, what's it modifying? And I'm not sure, maybe the next edition of BBG, if I do one, I'll take this out. Because really what I do more is when I see a participle, the first question I'm asking myself, is this adverbial or is it adjectival? If it's anarthrous, it's probably going to be adverbial. If it's articular, it has to be adjectival. Okay, I make that decision. If I decide that the participle is adverbial, then I know that it is modifying some word, and that's where the case number and gender are going to come from, although the thrust or the meaning of the participle is directed toward the verb. And I can add in while or after, whether it's a present or aorist participle, if it fits the context. That's simple. If, however, I've looked at a participle and I've seen, now this is an adjectival participle, I have a decision I have to make, and that is it attributive or is it a substantive? Is it modifying another noun or is it standing on its own? Well, if it's an attributive participle, it means it's modifying something. And normally ing works okay well with these, but you may have to add in a who or a which to make sense. But if that adjectival participle is functioning substantively, in other words, there's no noun for it to modify, then I know it's performing a function in the sentence. Maybe the subject, maybe the direct object, maybe an indirect object, maybe an object of a preposition. It all depends upon the context. But in the translation, you have to add in words that make it stand on its own as a noun, as a substantive. Okay? So you do those, especially steps 2, 3, and 4. Now here's the rest of the chart. You can't translate it yet. You've got to look at the tense of the participle and ask yourself the question about aspect. And again, here I'm primarily thinking about adverbial participles. If it is a present participle, if it's a participle that's formed on the present tense stem of the verb, I'm going to try to make it continuous. If it's formed on the aorist stem of the verb, I'm going to try to translate the participle as an undefined. Okay? I have to ask the question about voice. Is the participle active, middle, or passive? And is the lexical form deponent or not? And then finally, I have to ask the question of meaning. What does the word mean? But those are the 6 or 7 questions that you have to ask of every participle you meet. But again, let me stress, if this just is too much for you right now, if you're an overload, just use ing. Okay, just use ing, get through your sentence, and if it makes sense, maybe that's enough. But maybe you're going to have to fine-tune it a little more. But just do that. But sooner or later, you're going to have to develop the facility of asking all these questions and really giving a full, complete translation of your participle. Okay? All right. Now, before we go to the vocabulary, let me just say just a couple of things. There's only 5 words in this vocabulary. I only needed to teach you 5 words to get through the exercise. So sometimes the vocab sections are a little smaller in the book. That's fine. My goal was to give you workbook exercises and not have to teach you words that occur less than 50 times, except for a couple. So some of these chapters have just a few vocab words. That's okay. Notice the percentage. We're getting closer to that 80%. 8 out of every 10, 4 out of every 5 word forms you see in the Bible. You're going to know we're getting there. We'll get there at the end of the book. I want to emphasize something though about reviewing. One of the things that's always been frustrating to me is that I'll get quizzes back from students, and they'll say this is a genitive, plural, feminine, aorist participle. I go, yeah, you got the parsing right. And they'll say from, and then they forget the lexical form and the definition. And the way I grade parsings, that means you've lost all 2 points in the parsing. That always was frustrating to me because these students were working so hard to learn the grammar, but they didn't remember what the words meant. So you can learn all the grammar in the world about participles, but if you don't know your lexical forms, if you don't know what these words mean, you can't translate the passage. So please, I know it's hard with all the grammar you're having to keep in your head, but make sure you're reviewing your vocabulary. Use flashworks, use your flashcards, whatever you need to. Make sure you're viewing your words and you're remembering lexical forms, what they mean. You need the lexical forms to know whether the word's deponent or not, right? So lexical forms, meaning, make sure you're reviewing all that stuff so you can do all of the parsing exercises, okay? All right. Well, here's the vocabulary. Dechomai. I take, receive. Dakeo. I think, seem. Estheo. I eat. Pempo. I send. Pharaoh. I carry, bear, produce. In chapter 30, we're going to be learning perfect participles. There's a few other things in the chapter, like genitive absolutes and periphrastic constructions, but most of the chapter is about the perfect or the completed participle. And one of the things that's really nice is that this is the last chapter on participles, all right? So once you've learned this chapter, you've learned all you're going to need to know for first year Greek on perfect participles. So congratulations. Let me just, in a very general sense, give you an overview of the formation and the meaning of the perfect participle. In terms of the formation of the perfect participle, it's formed, as you would expect, on the perfect tense stem. But I need to point out something about vocalic reduplication. You remember back when you were learning reduplication, I said that if the perfect tense stem starts with a vowel, the reduplication is the lengthening of that vowel, and then it looks just like an augment, but it's not the augment, and you have to keep them separate. Okay, this is why I said that. Think of the word like agapao. When agapao goes into the aorist, the alpha lengthens to an eta. So if you have an aorist participle, that eta unaugments back up to an alpha, right? Okay, but when you get to the perfect, the alpha has undergone vocalic reduplication. The alpha's gone to an eta. But when you go into the participle, the eta stays. It does not unaugment because it's not an augment. It's vocalic reduplication, okay? The augment indicates past time, so you have to get rid of it in an aorist participle. But the vocalic reduplication in the perfect indicates completed action, and so it stays, okay? So in terms of formation, the perfect participle is formed off of the perfect tense stem, and it maintains the vocalic reduplication, as well as the consonantal reduplication. There are a few second perfects in Greek, but there's not many of them, let's just say in Biblical Greek. And I've stuck them in the advanced information section. So the forms that I'm going to be showing you in this chapter are all first perfects, okay? Okay. What about the meaning of a perfect participle? Well, as you would expect from the indicative, the perfect participle indicates a completed action with ongoing consequences into the present of the speaker. That's the same significance in the participles. They indicate a completed action, and therefore they're going to be in the past. But that's not the primary significance. The primary significance is that the action's completed and that it has present consequences. So the question is, how do you bring that into English? And my suggestion, kind of as a default translation, kind of like with just ing with the other participles, I think the default translation is whenever you see a perfect participle, just translate after, having, and then the past participle form of the English verb, the third principal part of the English verb. So it would be after having eaten, if it were, for example, the perfect participle of estheo. So after having and the third principal part. That's just kind of a default translation, and it works in most situations, okay? All right. Well, let's get into the specifics of how you form the perfect participle. The first perfect or completed active participle is formed with reduplication, the perfect active tense stem, a tense formative, which is kappa, come back to that in a second, The participle morpheme, which is omicron tau, come back to that in a second too, and then case endings. And so you get a form like leleucatus. So if you saw leleucatus, you would see the lambda epsilon. Okay, it's a perfect form. It's from luo. The kappa would tell you it's in the perfect, and the ot you would remember as the alternate active participle morpheme along with nu tau. All right. So what's going on with these two variations, tense formative and participle morpheme? This is a real technical discussion. If you want to read more about it, pick up my morphology. But this is a slightly simplified answer, but it works for teaching in first year. So that's why I do it this way. Just memorize that the kappa alpha, the normal tense formative for the perfect, simplifies, and you have a kappa. And on the participle morpheme, omicron tau is just the active participle morpheme. Some people think of the omicron as a connecting vowel, but for various reasons, I think omicron tau is the participle morpheme. The omicron tau shouldn't, though, give you a lot of trouble, because when you have nu tau, you have omicron nu tau. So you just drop out the nu, and it's no big deal. But anyway, that's how you form the perfect, the first perfect active participle. You go into the paradigm, and you can see leleucos, leleuquia, leleucas, and then it gets very regular, as you would expect. Leleucatas, leleuquias, leleucatus. You can see what's happening, I'm sure. In the masculine and the nominative singular, the tau dropped out because of the sigma, the omicron lengthened to an omega, but after that, it's exactly what you'd expect. Dative plural, the tau drops off too. In the neuter, the tau dropped out because of the sigma, but the omicron didn't do anything, perfectly regular from there. And since these are third declension endings, and since the feminine has to be first declension, you have the normal significant shift, and cos goes to quia, but after that is perfectly regular. So the 6 forms you need to learn are cos, quia, cas, katas, quias, katas. You move into the middle passive, and it's reduplication plus the perfect middle passive tense stem. The participle morpheme, which is the one we've learned all along, it's men, and then case endings, and you get lelumenoi. Again, you see that the participle is pushed right up against the tense stem, but you're used to that in the perfect middle passive. No big deal, right? The paradigm is almost not worth showing you because it's so regular. It shouldn't give you any problems at all. Well, if it is giving you problems, then you are in trouble. But I'm sure by now you guys are doing fine. And the 6 forms you have to learn are menas, and after that they're perfectly regular. Mene, menon, menu, menes, menu. Okay, well that's it for the perfect participle, and that's it for participles as a whole, okay? But there's a few other little oddities connected with the participle that we need to cover in the chapter. The first is what's called a genitive absolute. Now, an absolute construction in any language is a construction that is unrelated grammatically to the rest of the sentence. In other words, the absolute means it's not connected, it's just kind of hanging there. When you come to Greek, the genitive absolute is defined this way. You have a noun or pronoun in a genitive, and then you have a participle in the genitive, and these two words are not grammatically connected to the rest of the sentence. Now, I probably should mention that you can have some genitive absolutes without the noun or pronoun, but most genitive absolutes have a noun or pronoun. So a genitive absolute is when you have a noun or a pronoun and a participle, both in the genitive, and they are grammatically disconnected from the rest of the sentence. And one of the odd things that's going on in this construction is that the noun or pronoun in the genitive is functioning as if it were the subject of the participle. Now, participles technically can't have subjects, but the noun or pronoun in the genitive is functioning as if it were, okay? So that's the basic definition of what a genitive absolute is. Let's look at a couple of examples, and you'll see them in context. Well, the first is, and immediately, and let's ignore the eti for a second. And immediately, and then you would be translating this, of him speaking. Well, that doesn't make any sense. But then it continues, Judas arrives. Well, you can see that the basic sentence is, and immediately Judas arrives. And then you have this eti autou laluntas. Now, if you don't recognize this as a genitive absolute, it can be really frustrating. And actually, that's one of the main clues of a genitive absolute. You're translating along and you hit this noun or pronoun in the genitive, and then you got a participle in the genitive, and it just doesn't make sense. All right. Well, the clue is it's a genitive. Okay. And so when you see that, oh, this is probably a genitive absolute. So what you do in this sentence is that you would translate it, and immediately the autus, the noun or pronoun of the genitive, functioning as if it were the subject of the participle, and immediately he speaking. Okay, most of the participles in genitive absolutes are temporal, and so you can add while or after. And so you would say, and immediately while he is speaking, and then the eti is just a little adverb, and immediately while he is still speaking, Judas comes. Okay, did you follow that? So what you do is that you hit the noun or pronoun in the genitive and then the participle. Perhaps it doesn't make sense at first, and you realize, oh, they're genitives. Okay, this is a genitive absolute. Most genitive absolutes are temporal, so you can use while if it's present and after if it's an aorist, but most of them are presents. And then you translate the noun or pronoun in the genitive as if it were the subject. Okay, so and immediately, while he is still speaking, Judas arrives. All right, let's look at the second example. These things he speaking. Doesn't make any sense, does it? But if you go to the rest of the sentence, it's easy. Many believed in him. Okay, so the basic sentence is many believed in him. But this tauta autu laluntis, you go, that didn't make any sense. Oh, these are genitive. Okay, this is a genitive absolute. What's tauta? Well, you might think initially it's nominative, but it can't be nominative because there's nothing for it to modify, and the subject is poloi. So tauta has to be an accusative. It, in fact, is the direct object of laluntas. Welcome to Greek, right? Yeah, sometimes you can have direct objects before verbs. It's okay. But you have the genitive absolute, which is autu laluntis. So it is while, and then autu, he, laluntis, was speaking tauta these things, many believed in him. As you can see with genitive absolutes, it's kind of like participles are on steroids. Some participles you have to really think grammatically and see all the linkages and then say, okay, how do I say that in English? When it comes to genitive absolutes, you really have to do that. There's no way to translate a genitive absolute word for word. So you identify that it is a genitive absolute, and then you see where all the pieces fit grammatically, and then you say, okay, how do I say this in English? Okay, as long as you recognize this as the genitive absolute, they're pretty straightforward. It shouldn't cause you a ton of problems anyway. Okay, let me give you just a couple of clues, and I've mentioned some of them already, but let me kind of pull them all together in one place for identifying genitive absolutes. First of all, the participle is always going to be an arthrous. They're always adverbial participles, and most of them are temporal. So that's just why you can have the while and the after. The majority of genitive absolutes are use present tense verbs, present tense participles. So again, that should jump out a bit at you. One of the nice things, too, about genitive absolutes is they tend to occur at the beginning of a sentence in narrative. You don't tend to find genitive absolutes in Paul, for example, in theological discussion, but it is part of the storytelling methods of Greek. That's where you tend to find the genitive absolutes. So you're going to be reading a narrative, and it's going to be the beginning of the sentence. It's probably going to be a present participle. Most certainly it's going to be an adverbial present participle, okay? And then you use while or after and translate the noun or pronoun in the genitive as the subject of the participle. There is one other clue in the textbook, and that is a lot of genitive absolutes, I just sat down and counted them up to find this, is that they will use autu, a form of he, and then the participle will be a form of lego or laleo. And so you can see why that would happen. While he is speaking, or while he was saying these things, then this happened. So that often is what you're going to find in genitive absolutes. There's also quite a few genitive absolutes in the New Testament using ginomai. But those are kind of the clues that you're hitting a participle. But the main clue is that you're reading along and you hit this genitive and it doesn't make any sense. And it's just got to click. Oh, it's genitive. It's a genitive. It could be a genitive absolute. Okay? All right. So much for genitive absolutes. The other odds and end I wanted to share with you relative to participles is something called periphrastic constructions. In English, we use helping verbs. Okay? That's how we sometimes form our different tenses. And Greek doesn't do that for the most part. But there is one place in which there are helping verbs. They're called periphrastic constructions. Periphrastis just means a roundabout way of saying something. And a periphrastic construction is, instead of just using a simple verb, you use a form of a me, and then you take that verb and put it into a participial form. And the periphrastic way of stating it is to have a me plus the participle of the verb. Originally, the periphrastic construction was an emphasis on the linear or the ongoing continuous nature of the verb. Now, there are other ways to emphasize that, like using imperfect, but if the Greeks wanted to really emphasize the continuous nature of an action, they would use a periphrastic construction. It's really been slipping in Greek usage, and then you will find periphrastic constructions where there's no emphasis on the linear aspect beyond just the meaning of the verb or something like that. So just because it's periphrastic in the Bible doesn't mean you can really, preach the linear aspect of the form. In fact, in the third person plural, perfect middle passive, Greeks use periphrastics instead of the regular simple form of the verb. It's just something that language is always changing. That's what was going on. So, the thing about Greek periphrastic constructions is that we translate them very easily in English. In fact, you'll probably even translate it, not know that's what you're doing. But for example, there's a chart in the book, and I'm not going to spend the time now to go through them, so make sure you look at them. But for example, there's a periphrastic imperfect. Okay, in other words, the imperfect is already continuous, but if you really wanted to push and to emphasize the continuous nature of the verb, you would use the imperfect form of a me, and then you would use the present form of the participle. So if the verb is to sit, you would say, like, to say they were sitting, it's eison kathemenoi. That's one of the examples in the workbook. You'll see it. So the periphrastic construction is just the use of a me plus the participial form of the verb. They are, I am, and the verb. It'll be easy for you to translate. The only thing that perhaps is a little tricky is that sometimes you can put words between a me and the participle. And what will happen is that you'll translate a me, and then you'll be reading along, and all of a sudden you can hit a participle, and you can go, oh, that doesn't make any sense. It doesn't fit. And, it connects with the a me, and it's a periphrastic construction. Okay? All right. There's one other thing that I wanted to share, and that is something about adverbial participles. I've already given you several special ways to translate adverbials. Some adverbial participles are temporal, right? And so if it's present, we use when or while. If it's an aorist, we can use after. I also said that some adverbial participles are causal. And in other words, they're showing the cause of something, and so you can use because in front of the participle. Well, there are other special uses of adverbial participles. In fact, there's a lot. You'll be meeting a lot of these in second-year Greek, and you should take second-year Greek. But there's three that I want to introduce to you in this textbook because they're in the workbook for this chapter. Some adverbial participles are classified as instrumental. In other words, there you can use the keyword by, but the participle is the instrument or the means by which an action is done. So Paul will say, we toil working with our hands. Well, we toil. How? What's the instrument of our toil? Well, it's by working with our hands. Okay? So that's the instrumental participle. There's also a concessive participle, and the key phrase for this is even though. In other words, you'll be reading along and you'll say, having eyes you do not see. Okay, it kind of makes sense, but make it proper English. Well, even though you have eyes, you do not see. Okay, so there's instrumental, there's concessive, and then for lack of a better phrase, some participles are just translated as regular verbs. And the main example of that is a kind of a strange idiom where the Greek will say, answering, he said. And most people feel that you can just say, he answered and said, or in a lot of modern translations, they just drop the participle out completely because it's such horrid English and just say, he answered. Okay, so in that situation where you have a participle and another regular verb, sometimes you're going to translate the participle as a regular verb as well, usually in that kind of construction. Okay? All right. Well, so much for participles. Let's go to the summary and remind ourselves what we have learned. A participle is a verbal adjective, an ing word. Because it's a verbal adjective, it can function adverbially. In this case, it agrees with the word that is doing the participle, the action of the participle, in case, number, and gender, but the thrust of the meaning of the participle is directed towards the verb. Adverbial participles are often functioning as temporal clauses, which is why we have while or after, but you can also use the keywords because, by, through, or translate it as a finite verb. But participles are also verbal adjectives. And just like any adjective, they can function either as an attributive or substantively. An attributive participle will agree with the word it is modifying in case, number, and gender, and it's usually articular. The case of a substantival participle will be determined by its function in the sentence, its gender and number by what it is referring back to. It too will be usually articular, and you will generally have to add in words to translate it. Participles do not indicate absolute time, they only indicate relative time. The present participle indicating an action occurring at the same time as the main verb, and the aorist participle indicated an action that happened prior to the time of the main verb. To that we could add the completed or the perfect participle indicating a completed action with consequences felt in the present of the speaker. The participle morpheme chart is now complete. Nu tau is used as an active and as an aorist passive morpheme. Omicron tau is used in the perfect active, and men with the appropriate vowel is used for all middle participles and all middle passive participles. The master participle chart is also complete, and you need to be able to repeat it, and especially the 6 memory forms. The present active uses on, usa, on, antas, uses, antas. Present middle passive, amanas, and from there you can figure it out. First aorist, sas, sasa, san, santas, sase, santas. First aorist middle is samanas. First aorist passive, thes, thesa, then, thentas, theses, thentas. The second aorist in the active in the middle is the same as in the present, and then the second aorist passive, the 6 forms are ace, asa, en, entas, ases, entas. In the perfect active, the 6 forms are kos, quia, kas, katas, quias, katas. And in the perfect middle passive, it's menas, and you can figure it out from there. Congratulations. Mede. But not, nor, not even. Presbyteros, presbytera, presbyteron. Elder, older.